Hey guys, Miss Warren here, back with more watercolor techniques. Now I'm ready to do the number 5 area, but I'm gonna do a little prep before I do that because if I look here, this area is still wet and I don't want it to bleed. I'm gonna take a very clean brush, squeeze out all the extra water into the cup, and I'm going to, this is called a thirsty brush, and I'm gonna soak up any pools of water just so it doesn't flow into the other side there. Just kind of picking that up, and then I'm gonna squeeze it out. Okay, now I'm gonna do a 1 color fade on my warm side. I'm gonna make sure that my brush is super clean and that I have some clean water. Now this is my dirty cup of water. I wouldn't wanna use that water on a 1 color fade because as you add more water, you want it to get clearer. I have a cleaner cup of water here. And when I add water to it, I want that water to be clean so it doesn't muddy my color. So my first round, I'm gonna get almost purely that color. I want it to be pretty dark. I want a lot in my brush. So then I'm going to start at this edge and I'm gonna pull all the same direction. Also look, I'm just using the tip of my brush. I'm not smashing it down. I'm not going back and forth. I'm pulling one singular direction and I'm using the very ends of the hairs of my brush. I'm gonna grab a little more paint because this is where we want our darkest colors on this side. I'm gonna layer over it one more time, going one singular direction, just using the very ends of the hairs of my brush. If you smash your brush into the paper, it will mess up your brush and it will mess up the paper. Okay, now I think I'm ready to start fading out the color. And to fade out the color, I'm gonna add more water to my brush. I'm just dipping it right in the cup. And I'm gonna put that on the paper. I'm gonna spread that wet paint further down, kind of keeping it smooth. I'm using the very ends of the hairs of my brush and I'm pulling it all one singular direction. You can see as I let the paint's kind of running out and the water's increasing that it gets lighter. I'm gonna get a little more water and get yet lighter. Smoothing it out as I go. I rarely pass over an area more than twice. A lot of watercolor is just letting it do its thing. Now, if you want it to get a little darker up here, which I think I do because it kind of suddenly changes to light, I'm gonna get a little more paint and I'm gonna put a little more in this area, but you gotta be really delicate going over it one more time, even if it is to smooth it out, because you can tear up your paper really easily once it's wet. So very gently, I can do a second layer. Now, if you want to get really dark and really build up your values, you need to wait for it to dry entirely, and then you can do a second layer of values and you can blend 2 colors together. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and go to the 6th one, the salt in the warm colors. So I'm gonna very quickly put down some warm colors. I'm gonna put down mostly red, and I'm gonna do kind of like a dancing motion here. So you notice even kind of with this more dancing kind of decorative motion here that I'm doing, I'm not pressing hard. I'm using just the tip of my brush and I'm going down the page. If you want to get darker, you can add a little more paint. And you can dab it, but I'm not smashing it. I'm just like lightly dabbing it, getting some texture in here. But I want to do this kind of quickly because I want to cover this area before it dries so I can get some salt in it. If you want white in your watercolor painting, leave the white of the paper because there is no white watercolor. Let me get some salt on this before it dries. There we go. And once I get the salt on there, I'm not gonna touch it anymore because that little speck texture will fade away if I scrub at it, and it will tear up the paper. So if you want white in your watercolor, just leave the white of the paper for the little shine reflective points. Okay, so now I'm gonna do number 7 here. 2 color fade cool. I'm gonna make sure my brush is really clean because I was just using a warm color. And I'm going to go with blue for sure. I'm gonna do blue at the top. So I'm gonna load up my brush. And I wanna go careful near the edges because the 2 colors beside me are still a little bit wet. So this is very similar to the 1 color fade, only when we start to thin our second color out, add a little bit of water. As soon as it starts getting lighter, that's the area we're gonna start adding a second color. Still a lot of paint on my paper. It's kind of puddling up, so I'm gonna wring out my brush and like pick a little bit of this up. Here we go. Now I'm gonna start from the bottom with another color. I think I'm gonna go with green. Wash out my brush really, really well before I pick up some green out of the palette. I'm gonna start with a dark green here. And I'm gonna slowly fade out as I get. There's a few crystals of salt on there because I did the salt earlier, but that's okay. It's not gonna hurt anything. It's not gonna affect the gradient. Okay, now I'm not just gonna stop there. I'm gonna overlap the green and the blue because I want like a blue-green in the middle. Okay, I think I'm gonna rinse out my brush really well. I think I'm gonna grab a little more of the blue, and I'm gonna get a little more blue in my green. I want a nice blue-green color fade. There we go. Yet again, we don't want to go over the same spot too much. Okay, now we got one more section. We're gonna do wet into wet cool. Now I don't recommend often using green and purple together with wet into wet because sometimes it mixes a little bit too much and you'll get some neutral colors. So I think I'm going to do maybe a blue with some flecks of purple in it, or maybe some purple. Yeah, let's do some blue with some flecks of purple in it. So I'm gonna start with blue in my wet into wet section. Now I wanna get the paint on here really quick. And I want it to have a decent amount of water. Oh, I dripped into my yellow, do you see there? Now I made some green in my section, so you do need to go carefully with this. It's going a little bit too quickly. So fill in that area with a nice layer of paint. And then quickly before it dries, but carefully so you don't mess up your colors like I did over here, you wanna wash out your brush really, really well. Can't forget that. And then you're gonna pick up some of another color and you're gonna drop it into the wet paint and watch it spread. Okay, so that's your wet into wet technique. Okay, so there's all your watercolor techniques that you need to practice. Go ahead and give it a try, and I look forward to seeing your work.